Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. Tim Osborne from A2LA and myself, we are very excited to bring you today's webinar titled The Most Impactful Changes to ISO 17025-2017 and How Qualtrax Can Help. My name is Karen Arriviaga, and I am an account executive here at Qualtrax. And I work mostly with our laboratory prospects and customers who are accredited or who are in the process of becoming accredited to 17025. To review the outline for today's event, first we will share the presentation by Tim addressing the changes in the new standard. Then I will follow that with a quick session on how Qualtrax addresses these changes and how you can use a quality management system for that. And then I'm actually have Tim live for about a 10-minute question and answer session towards the end. We expect this webinar to run about an hour. As you have questions throughout the webinar today, please feel free to put those into the Zoom application question and answers area. We'll be monitoring them, and we will definitely bring them up at the end of the presentation. To give you a heads up, we have a large number of people on this webinar today, so we might not be able to get to all of the questions. However, somebody from Qualtrax or A2LA will reach back out to you once the webinar is over to answer any questions that you might have. Plus, this webinar will be recorded and sent out to everybody that did register for the event. And so at any time, you will be able to watch a recording of this webinar at your convenience. So before I kick off Tim's presentation, I want to introduce you to Tim. Tim is actually the Senior Director of Training Services at A2LA. Prior to A2LA, he was the Director of Quality for Trescal Inc., where he developed, oversaw, and participated in the internal and commercial training programs. Tim also represented NCSL International, which is a liaison to ISO, as a technical expert on Working Group 44, which is actually responsible for crafting the ISO 17025-2017 version. He's also a volunteer at NCSLI by offering courses on accreditation, ISO 17025, traceability, measurement methods, and uncertainty. So without further ado, I'm going to bring you Tim's presentation. I hope you enjoy.
We're going to cover today why there are changes to 17025 and what are they. And we're going to focus today on 5 key areas: customer confidence, process and risk management, a new concept in 17025, continuous improvement, sampling, and electronic systems. But first, before we get started, I want to make sure that everybody is relaxed. And the reason I say this is because there is a lot of consternation about all these different changes, the changes to the structure, or these new terms that have come out. And really, these are terms that you've already been using, you just haven't named them. A lot of these concepts your companies already utilize. So with that, I want to try and diffuse as much of the anxiety as I possibly can before we get launched into the balance of the rest of this presentation. So, why did ISO revise 17025? Well, primarily is because they're trying to instill customer confidence. And you probably are asking yourself, well, okay, how does that instill customer confidence? Well, most people think of a structural shift that all it does is it creates anxiety. But structural shifts, when they actually contribute to a process flow, actually build customer confidence because it actually makes sense. So ISO thought it was important to make sure that all of the conformity assessment standard structures were aligned with the process flow philosophies of 9001. Since a lot of the companies, a majority of the companies in the world, if they're registered, certified, or accredited, are registered or certified to ISO 9001. So these customers are already familiar with this. So bringing this into the 17025 realm actually does make a lot of sense. So as I said, all of the conformity assessment standards, the 17,000 series standards, such as 17,011, which the accrediting bodies are beholden to, 17021, 17025, which we're going to focus on today, 34, 43, 65, and so on, all have changed or will be changing to this format. So what really changed? Well, scope and normative references really didn't change in the standard. That's something that was there altogether. the things that we will talk about with respect to the scope have changed, but the content in and of itself really hasn't. Now, in the 2005 version of the 17025, we had no definitions, no terms. In this version, we have 9 terms and definitions. We are not going to cover them all in this. This is not a full-length class. This is more of a 30,000-foot overview of what has happened in the standard. However, the requirements did change in the standard substantively. So if you recall from 2005, we had 2 sections after the terms and definitions. We had Section 4, which were the management system requirements, and Section 5, which were the technical requirements. Now we have 5 sections. The general requirements, if we were to equate them to anything, would be the values proposition for the standard. And we'll talk about impartiality and confidentiality, or core values of an organization. We'll talk about structural things very briefly, which focuses on the organization itself, the people within the organization, and the processes that it has to employ in order to meet the scope of this document. We'll spend a considerable amount of time on resources, specifically personnel resources. We'll talk about processes, which is in Section 7 of the standard, which is everything that you do to produce the product you're giving to your customer, some sort of report, testing calibration report. And then we'll talk about the management system very briefly from a continuous improvement perspective. But we're not going to spend much time in any of these macroscopically. We're going to skim over them as we go through this presentation. We do offer courses outside of this that can elaborate on these if you're curious about the depth that we're going to provide you today. So primarily in the definitions, the laboratory focuses on 3 things. A laboratory is a body that provides testing services, calibration services, and sampling. But sampling is not a standalone activity. Sampling has to feed into calibration and or testing services. So if you're trying to establish traceability or maintain traceability of a sample, it has to go through the testing or calibration process. The standard is also designed, which is a considerable step from where it was in the 2005 process, as for single-person laboratories. It's also designed for multi-location laboratories, for brick and mortar, and for mobile laboratories as well. But it is not designed around accreditation. Now, accrediting bodies can provide a service for you to give you an independent attestation to your abilities to perform the work that you claim you can do, but it's not required of the standard. So when you look at the changes in the terminology and the use of the clauses, you will see that words like scope are removed because it has this connotation of accreditation, and we wanted to try and remove that from the standard. So when you're talking about customer performance and customer confidence, the first thing that you have to consider are, who are your customers? They're your stakeholders. You have internal customers, the people that are performing the activity that you're providing to your external customers or internal customers if you're a captive laboratory, and any regulators and accrediting bodies, people or groups of people or specifiers that tell you these are the requirements by which you have to provide the service. So if you're beholden to the FDA requirements or things like that, or EPA, then this is where you would fall and identify what the requirements are for the product that you are going to provide. The first thing in the scope it talks about is impartiality. Now, impartiality is the presence of objectivity, and we're going to talk about that here. But while we're talking about impartiality, we also have to talk about confidentiality. If you recall from the general requirements that I mentioned at one of the opening slides, these two, Section 4.1 and 4.2, make up those general requirements. The confidentiality is primarily making sure that you keep things private, that you don't disclose information that don't require it. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about briefly about customer confidence is if we breach that, then we have a mechanism by which we can capture that, which is not new to you for those of you who are exposed to the 2005 standard. Different section, but the same concept. It's a measure of dissatisfaction where a response is expected. So these are the three terms that I wanted to talk about with respect to customer confidence. But getting back to the impartiality, the things that we have to do differently are that we have to identify what these risks are, where we are exposing ourselves. It could be members of a board. You could be a committee member. If you're on an ASTM or an IEEE or other standards development organizations, you are an influencing factor. And because you're an influencing factor, by definition, you can be influenced. So how does that work? What other organizations or stakeholders can influence you? The other day I was talking about working with forensics laboratories. When a police officer or a group of people come in and they really want you to push through the sample and the sample analysis so they can convict somebody, well, now there's some undue stress and undue pressure that even the old standard addresses, but now they want you to identify those, and what also they want you to do is they want you to mitigate those risks. So how do you do that? Well, I guarantee you, already probably have some mechanisms in place. As you see here on the visual, you have confidentiality statements or that your HR department probably launches that you're required to sign as soon as you're hired. Some of them are included in the employee handbook. Sometimes they're external forms, whatever that might be. You probably also have whistleblower policies. So if something were to go wrong in your organization where you see impartiality being displayed, then you have the ability to voice your opinion on those things. Between organizations, they have NDAs or non-disclosure agreements. Another way to manage it is an organizational structure. Most people use organizational charts. In the new version of the standard, there is no requirement for an organizational chart. So how might you do that? I leave that to you. Now, we talked about confidentiality and making sure that things are kept private. So just to reiterate, even though confidentiality is not defined in 17025, it is defined in the ISO world as a property that information is not available or disclosed to unauthorized individuals. In the new standard, it tells you the different mechanisms by which confidentiality could be breached and how you have to manage it. It doesn't tell you specifically how to manage it, but that you do. And those opportunities come within what we already understood in 2005 as being from the customer-vendor relationship confidentiality, but the new standard talks about Freedom of Information Act. So for example, if you're providing information to a customer and you're required to provide information to a regulating body or a legal entity, you have to let the customer know in advance of informing the regulating body or the legal entity to whom you're reporting. So these are things that we have to consider moving forward. Now, the second part of this customer confidence that's discussed in the scope is competence. And we're going to spend a considerable amount of time in this webinar focusing on competence and why it's so important. Primarily, we're going to focus on, as I started out this webinar, on personnel. So what we have changed in the standard, while in section 552 of the old standard we talked about a procedure for training, now we're focused in 2017 on competency. So in this procedure we have to determine the competency requirements. So you'll see there's a lot more front-end work that has to be done in this process now that we didn't have before, which is a good thing from an HR perspective and from a management perspective because it costs a lot of money to invest in bringing somebody on board and training them and keeping them on board. So front-loading your work is actually a good thing. Then you have to select them, you have to train them, supervise, authorize, and now a new addition to the standard is you have to monitor them. So there's a concept developing here that I'm going to introduce to you. It's called the continuous improvement model. And we'll spend a little bit more time later on in this webinar discussing that. But what was removed is the competency requirements for quality manager and technical manager, and the positional responsibilities for quality manager and technical manager, if you recall from the old standard in section 4.1, and also in internal auditing. There's also no requirements or mandates for top management to do anything in the standard anymore either. Everything is competency-based because, if you recall from the old standard, there were deputies that had to be named with competencies and things like that. All that's been removed. Now, when we look at the procedure for determining competency, selecting the people, training, supervising, authorizing, and monitoring, which we do in performance evaluations and we do in quality assurance through PT and interlaboratory comparisons and quality sampling and all these other different avenues, this is a mechanism by which we can do this, and we can improve the processes and improve our personnel and actually get them trained where training is needed. The third component that you'll see in the scope, if you look at it, is consistency. So we have impartiality, competency, and consistency. And consistency is extremely important when we're dealing with customer confidence. Now you'll look at this and you'll say, well, Tim, there are only 4 sections up there. Aren't there more things that we're concerned with respect to consistency? Absolutely. Let's consider consistency as, if you grant me this idiom, a 4 on the floor and 1 in the seat. Where the 4 on the floor would be the general requirements in Section 4 or the values of the organization. Section 5 are the structural requirements, which are the viability organization that responds to customer needs and requirements and exceeds them or maybe just meets them. Section 6, or the third wheel, is the resources of the people, the facilities, equipment, traceability, and managing all the vendors, all of which contribute to a successful laboratory activity. The fourth wheel would be the processes, or Section 7. These are the ways in which you define how your business functions in order to ensure consistency. Now, what's in the seat? Well, the seat is the management system. This serves as a mechanism to check the things that we say we actually do, and if not, we make the appropriate adjustments. So now you see why we only have Section 7.7 through 8.9 listed in the diagram. Those are the 4 on the floor. These are the mechanisms by which we can check. These are the stop gaps to assist us with product consistency and continual improvement, which we'll talk about later on in the webinar. So let's get to consistency. So in order for consistency to achieve its goals, you have to have communication. You have to have leaders that establish a plan, and you have to have the people that are in production that are producing this laboratory activity, and communication. And as you see in the illustration here, communication has to go both ways. The leaders communicate the vision of the company to the production people, and the production people tell the leaders things are going very well, or there's an opportunity here to make things better. Let's work something out and put things into play. And I want you to keep this illustration in mind because we're going to see this later on in the webinar. So, as we talked about, the heart of this matter is customer confidence. So, the next is, when we talked earlier in the presentation, we listed impartiality, confidentiality, and we listed complaints. Well, if you recall from the pyramid that we just went through, complaints is one of those feedback mechanisms that we have. It's an expression of dissatisfaction from the customer. Doesn't matter what customer, where it comes from. It could be the internal customer, it's the external customer, the regulators, the ABs, whoever. Doesn't matter. Those are all people, these stakeholders that we talked about previously, that can formulate a complaint. But a complaint is only a complaint if the response is expected. So, what does the standard require now? Well, in 2005, it required that you had a procedure for it. Now, it says a documented process. So I know your question is, well, what's the difference between documented process and procedure? By the number of words and the number of syllables. Well, that's the easy part. Actually, the documented process is actually a lot easier to manage than a procedure. Because in the documented process, you just have to make it available to people. So all you have to do is describe what that process is, and effectively you've met that. So you can publish something on a website that describes that, hey, we receive it, we will respond to it within so many days, we'll investigate it, and we will let you know what the status of the validation of that complaint is, and we'll communicate with you. It can be something that simple. But as you see up here on the screen, the documented process has to have 4 components to it. You have to receive it. You have to validate it. That means you have to have competent people that can determine whether or not it is a valid complaint or not, and that you have sufficient information. You investigate it, and you have to put plans in place of action, some corrective, some corrective actions. So these are the things that you have to consider as part of that. You also have to track all of these complaints and record the actions that were taken as a consequence of them, and communicate with the complainant and be impartial in doing that. So if you recall, one of the things that we changed at the beginning of the standard was we designed it for the one-person lab. Well, to record and receive, validate, and investigate a complaint as a single-person laboratory, well, that seems like you can imbue some impartiality to it. Yeah, you can. But the standard requires that when you report back to the customer on these actions, you have an independent party that will validate whether or not your actions were complete or responsible and provide that response back to your customer or the complainant. So, customer confidence. The bottom line is down here on the bottom that you ensure that you have valid results. That is the key in this whole standard. If you have valid results, then you instill customer confidence, which is what all management is looking for. So how do we do this? Well, as I introduced earlier, we have this thing called risk management or processes that we have in place. So we're going to talk about this concept of process management moving forward. We'll talk about this methodology. And the first step in this methodology is, well, you have to identify what this process is. Well, in order to do that, you have to have customers. And those customers are your sources of input. And this illustration is exemplified in ISO 9001. So if you're familiar with that standard, you can go there and see a similar process output that they have in that standard as well. So if you recall, the performance requirements are generated by internal customers, external customers, regulators, and accrediting bodies. This is something we saw in the previous slide. So now that I know what my stakeholders want, they tell me through a phone call, through a contract, through emails, whatever mechanism it is, that's my input into my activity. It tells me what I need to do. My activity generates an output. In the case of the laboratory, it's a test report, calibration report, and then those receivers of output can be the sources of input. Or, like I said, with respect to confidentiality, I have to report back to a regulating body that, hey, this is the result of this EPA sample, stack sample that I did or something like that, provided I communicate that with the customer that this could be a potential receiver of output. Now, you have to keep in mind that this process methodology is not only just for the superficial or the high-level process, meaning you receive something from your customer to you give something back to your customer, but this process flow also works for internal processes, your baseline processes and your support processes. So this isn't just for getting stuff out the door. These are all the processes that fill in your organization to make sure that you get good product out the door. So in order to do this successfully, laboratories apply risk-based thinking, and we'll talk a lot about that here in a few slides. So with all this risk management stuff, what's up with decision rules? Well, as many of you know already, decision rules is the buzzword of the day. So, well, guess what? We had them in 2005. So as you see on the screen, well, where did we have it? Well, if you recall in 510.4.2, it says, when statements of compliance are made, the uncertainty of measurement shall be taken into account. So, okay, well, how is that risk management stuff? Well, according to 9000, ISO 9000 more correctly, and the definitions of risk is the effect of uncertainty. Well, if I turn this thing around, this statement that I've got before you in 510.4.2, if it's the effect of uncertainty, well, what is that effect? Well, it's the statement of compliance. So if I know what my uncertainty is, I can determine with some level of confidence what that conformity, which is now called conformance statement, is. Is it in tolerance? Is it out of tolerance? What is the surety by which I'm making that statement. That is a decision rule. So however you take it into account, that's what the decision rule is. So now what we've done is we've actually put a word or two words to something that you've already done. So decision rules. Decision rules in the new standard come at the front end of the process and the back end of the process. So at the front end of the process, we're focusing in on clearly defined decision rules between you and your customer. Okay? Now, what that means is you have to come to an agreement with how uncertainty is going to be taken into account. Now, for those of you who are not using measurement uncertainty and you're making statements of conformity because your uncertainties might be a qualitative analysis and not quantitative, or you're making an estimation of uncertainty and not evaluating it that rigorous way that the standard prescribes for some mechanisms, you need to have that conversation with the customer. If it's embedded within a method that the customer is telling you to test or to provide calibrations, then the decision rule is default and you report it accordingly. And the customer has to agree with this. So this is all front-end stuff. The aft end of the process, or where you're delivering it, is you have to apply the decision rule that the method or the customer specifies, and you have to report back to the customer in Section 7.8 what that decision rule was. If it was the default method in the test method, then that is sufficient. Otherwise, you have to say we did not take measurement uncertainty into account when we made a statement of conformance. The bottom line here with respect to the decision rules, we want to instill customer confidence, and we do that by ensuring the validity of results. And the more unsure we are about the results, or the larger the uncertainty we have about the results, the more risk there is involved with it. So there's a direct correlation between risk and measurement uncertainty. So while we've been using risk-based thinking all our lives, why did the standard change at all? Well, that's a really good question. Well, in the previous version of 17025, it was actually managed for us. Well, not many of us like being managed, right? So, well, how did that work out? Well, if you look at the standard, it told you had to have a quality manual. It told you had to have policies, procedures, job descriptions. Top management had to do certain functions. Quality managers had to do certain functions and have certain capabilities. Technical managers, there's improvements or preventive actions and corrective actions. That's a lot of stuff that you have to manage through. But in the new standard, it's about risk management. It's about documented information. What that means to you is that you can document policies and procedures where you think they're necessary. If they're not critical to your organization, and you'll notice as we go through the subsequent slides where all the procedures were in the old standard and you'll see what happened in the new standard, you'll see that there was a major diet that the standard went on. Now, does that mean you have to get rid of them? No. You can keep them and still be conformant to the new standard. You're just more restrictive, and that's okay. You're reducing your risk. That's okay too. So if we compare the two, we move from job descriptions to competencies and authorizations, top management to management and supervisors. So we're pushing decision making to the lowest level possible. You have decision rules, which we've already talked about, and we're going to talk about continuous improvement in the next few slides. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these slides, but you can see these are all of the procedures that the standard requires in 2005. This is what happens in 2017. That's considerably less that you have to manage. So just to reiterate, consistency in the laboratory relies on communication between the leaders and production and the leaders. It has to go both ways. So what's the importance there? Well, we're going to talk about that when we talk about continuous improvement. So what shape comes to your mind when you think about continuous improvement? I'll give you a second. A circle, right? There's no beginning, no end. It's continuous, right? All right, great. So how does that work? Well, let's start out on that. Remember, in the methodology and the process, we had to identify the process, and so we've identified the process. The leaders identify it. A new opportunity comes up to the laboratory. We want to start a new test method or a calibration. Okay, well, let's define that process. All right, we've done that. We've done the diligence. Recall the sources of input. We have the input. We define what has to go into this new opportunity. We've defined that activity, and we know what the receivers of output are going to be and what product that we're going to give, just to reiterate what that defining of the process is. Well, once we've defined what that process is, now we have to identify the risks and opportunities, which you've already been doing. You identify, all right, what things can go wrong and what things can go right with this new opportunity that we've taken, because risk is an effect of uncertainty. And if you recall about uncertainty, it has both positive and both negative effects to it. So when you're doing risks, you have to consider both. And when you identify what those risks and opportunities are, typically done in a SWOT analysis, now you put things in place to mitigate the negative impacts of risks. And what that looks like is you put in procedures or policies, or if you don't need procedures and policies, you just have communication plans. So you set the level of mitigation based upon the risk. And in order to make sure that you're managing that risk, you have to set your objectives. And those objectives appear in this evaluation. And when you do that and you did something very well and you want to scale back on it because it comes at a cost to you, then you make an adjustment. Okay? Or if you want to improve things because, hey, we don't have preventive actions in the new standard anymore because improvements and preventive actions are pretty much the same thing, we make those improvements. And it also allows for those areas where we get complaints and non-conforming work, which are corrective in nature, and all those feed into the plan. Now, when things change and you remember those times where you had to make changes to your management system and your processes, this is where the planning phase comes in. So you readjust your risks and opportunities, you readjust your objectives, and you continuously improve. And this is where this circle comes in that we were talking about earlier. So what are some other changes that could affect our laboratory? I'm glad you asked that question. So we're going to talk a little bit about sampling. Sampling did change because there were some people that in the working group that said we want sampling as a standalone activity. So what we had to do in the working group is we had to say, okay, that's fair, but we're not going to accredit sampling alone unless it is feeding into a test or a calibration activity. So fair enough. What does that do for us? Well, now instead of having a procedure for sampling, you have to have a plan for sampling, and you have to have a defined method for doing that. Well, what's the difference between a method and a procedure? In the ISO vernacular, they're synonymous. However, I'm going to let you play a little investigation game. There is one statement in the standard that says a method and procedure, and I'll leave that to you, or as they say in college, to the student to do that as an exercise for themselves. In the standard, it talks about subdivision in the handling section of it in 742. It talks about uncertainties and how they contribute to the overall uncertainty of the test or method process and that they have to be taken into consideration. And there is a reporting component in that as well in section 785. Now, what else? Well, we have a new concept. We moved from this 19th century paper generating business to now we're moving into the 20th century with electronics and data management. So we have this concept called Laboratory Information Management Systems, or LIMS. So in 2005, it was all about the paper chase, for those of you that might remember that old show. We had a quality manual, you had quality policies, you had master lists, approved vendor lists, policies, procedures. All that paper stuff, it's not saying you have to get rid of it, but a lot of that stuff, there wasn't value add in a master list and an approved vendor list and some of these policies and procedures. So we're letting you, using this risk-based thinking, adjust where necessary. And where ISO thought you needed a procedure, they told you when to have it. All right, now, so what is this LIMS? Well, we used to have in the standard about control of data, which we haven't rid ourselves of. That's still there. But now, like I've jokingly said, we have moved to a LIMS system or information management, because information systems is where everyone's going now. Okay? Now, in order for you to utilize a system, there are some key things that you need to know. One is it needs to be validated for functionality before you use it, before you broadcast it across your organization. You also have to record system failures and any actions that arose from them. So that's considered non-conforming work because it's affecting your laboratory activity. Further, If it's externally managed, i.e. it's on the cloud like Amazon or Google or somebody like that is hosting it for you, now you have to treat them as an external vendor, and they have to have their own competencies, and they have to meet the needs of your organization. So those are three things that I want you to take away, and Qualtrax is going to spend a little bit more time about their systems and how they meet all of these functions here. But the other thing that you have to ask yourself, if you do employ a LIMS, is that if you have any interfaces with other software, like you have customer resource management software, or CRMs, like Salesforce or vTiger, or anything else, a marketing thing that you're using to help you with your activity, those also have to be validated for functionality.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for reviewing Tim's presentation. So at this point, I'm actually going to dive into Qualtrax and give you a little tour of our system and how we address some of these changes in the standard. So for those of you who are not familiar with Qualtrax, we are a compliance management system. And so this stems from our history of working with ISO accredited organizations, ISO 9001, and then also the 17,000 series standards. Based on the new 17025-2017, we would be considered a laboratory information management system in the sense that you would be managing data with our software. We do take a technology team approach with how we offer services to our customers. So we offer a complete electronic quality management system, and then we pair that with our team commitment to our customers and the industries that they serve. A little bit about our company. We're actually celebrating our 25th anniversary this year, and the majority of our customers are actually 17025 accredited organizations. We ourselves are ISO 9001-2015. We just went through that certification last year, and we use our own product as our quality management system. And then something also that's neat to know is that we do have a 97% customer retention rate. We really take time to connect with our customers to understand the compliance pressures that they are under. We do routine customer engagement and product releases. The majority of those product release new features are actually coming directly from customer requests. Our customers are people that are making critical contributions to society who, as a result, are faced with heavy compliance burdens like ISO 17025. When laboratories turn to Qualtrax, there are some key pain points that they're really looking to solve. Number one, they want to increase their visibility into their quality initiatives and to their efforts so they can guarantee that they're ready for their next assessment. This also increases the communication between management and the producers. It's important to have all of your information in one centralized location and easily accessible. That way, decisions can be made and processes can be improved on. Also, they want to increase their efficiencies. One of the biggest time-saving benefits of Qualtrax is around audit preparation. We actually have customers that prior to Qualtrax used to spend months preparing for audits, but once they were able to bring in a system like Qualtrax, they're really able to narrow that down to a few days, hours. Some of our customers will actually say they barely do audit prep now because of the quality management system with Qualtrax. Quality managers who aren't using electronic QMS can sometimes find themselves chasing down colleagues or paperwork or constantly updating spreadsheets or emails, making sure their T's are crossed and their I's are dotted. Qualtrax really takes these administrative tasks off your plate so you can and really help with that audit prep. I'll say they want to increase accountability. By using Qualtrax, it will help hold your organization accountable to your customers and the standard. This is really around like the say what you do what you say, and then be able to show and prove that you did it. It also holds your colleagues accountable by managing individual tasks, even sending out constant reminders, holding people accountable to the responsibilities that they need to complete. And also, last one, but this is quite a big one. You heard Tim talk about it a lot in his presentation, but it helps decrease risk. When implementing Qualtrax, you are embedding a culture of quality and continuous improvement within your organization. As a result, you're more aware of the events and incidents that could occur and jeopardize your organization. As Tim pointed out with his slides on continuous improvement, Qualtrax will help you identify those risks and will give you a configurable platform to be able to make adjustments. All right, so with Qualtrax, it will help build confidence across your customer base, whether those are your internal stakeholders, your external customers, or even maybe the accrediting body that you are working with. So really to drive into the features of Qualtrax, with the changes in the standard, now you have more choice to show conformance to these requirements. Qualtrax gives you tools to help with this flexibility. There are four main features within Qualtrax: workflows, document management, testing and training, and then all of them are on a reportable platform. Some of the big differences between Qualtrax and some of our competitors are: one, we are an all-in-one solution. When you purchase Qualtrax, you get all of this functionality in one. And then second, these features are configurable. This is important when you consider what Tim said about continuous improvement. As you are identifying and managing risk, it's important to have a platform that you can grow and change with the decisions that you make for improvement. And that's where Qualtrax can really help you out. So the first area I'm going to really touch on is process management, or our workflow engine. With the changes in the standard, you now have more flexibility over maybe not having all of your standard operating procedures documented, but having a process that is controlled. So with Tim's presentation, now you have to prove that, number one, you have a procedure, you have competency around that procedure, that process is controlled, and you have visibility into that process. And this is really where some of our process automation and workflows can come in play. Workflows really allow you to map out any process that you have within your organization. Often we see customers automate processes like their corrective action requests, customer complaints, proficiency training, calibration procedures, or even validation processes, just to name a few. I'm going to show you an example of a workflow that we have in Qualtrax for customer complaints. The great thing about the workflows and the benefits of these is, like, number one, you have a way of recording all of the customer complaints that are coming to your organization. Because you have a record and you have a process that you're accepting these customer complaints, you're going to be able to track that customer complaint as it goes through each steps of this process. So what you're looking at right here is actually a flow diagram or a workflow of this full customer complaint process, from the point where somebody submits a customer complaint to the time that it's being reviewed, going to cause analysis for investigation, all the way to the point where it's being complete. With the system itself, you even have the ability to launch a corrective action request if you feel that that is necessary through the analysis of this customer complaint. Because this process is actually mapped out, you can guarantee that each customer complaint instance that comes in is going to follow the same steps every single time within your organization's process. With each new step, it's also good to know that automatic alerts will be sent out to responsible parties throughout this process, letting them know that they have a task that they need to complete. Plus, you gain visibility into this process. With Qualtrax, you can report at any point to see where a customer complaint is and where it is in the process, and if it's been finalized or not. And you can run reports on all of the customer complaints that you have in the system at once. With that being said, workflows with Qualtrax are also configurable. I think there's the one thing that we've known with working with all of our customers is that usually not every single customer is exactly the same, and their processes can be different. So with Qualtrax, number one, we'll actually give you some of these processes when you implement the system. We have our best-in-class workflows that kind of get you started down those paths. However, if you find something that you want to tweak or make adjustments to, we'll actually teach you through implementation how to make those adjustments. Plus, once you get that under your belt and you want to explore workflows even further, you can actually develop your own workflows and customize them from scratch. We actually have some organizations that have 60 to 70 plus workflows that they use for their daily operations. The next area I'm going to talk about is document management. The goal with document management functionality is to simplify the organization access updating process of document control. And this will be used for any documents that you choose to continue to control, whether those are standard operating procedures that you still want to have documents for, or other documents in your system. Some of the key benefits include keeping all of your documents located in one place for all of your colleagues to easily access. Documents are also controlled and revisions are tracked. This guarantees that only the most current version of any document is available for reference, and then there's no risk that somebody's going to get their hands on a document that's out of date. Also, automatic notifications again. Automatic notifications will get sent out to anybody that needs to edit, approve, or review documents. And these tasks will be assigned through role-based actions. So I'm going to show you next is a diagram of our document lifecycle process. Anytime a document comes into Qualtrax, you'll probably have a edit procedure to edit them maybe on a yearly basis. And so this is the process of what that would look like. They would go into edit, review, then to approval, whether they could be approved or rejected, published, and eventually they could be retired. Within Qualtrax, we are capturing all of the data automatically throughout this process. And I actually want to show you that. I have a screenshot. I'm going to log into Qualtrax real fast and show you what I mean by this. If I go to one of our documents, I'm going to show you the audit trail that a document would go through. If we go to history, this is the information that we are actually capturing through this process. And so you can see that we've got all the information for the past revisions, who edited the document when it was started, when it was released, the approval process, any changes that were made. If you are using track changes with Word, all of this information will be gathered through the comments that you're using with track changes. And this is something in our newest release that will be coming out. Plus, we're also gathering edit reason and so on. And so this is information that will automatically be tracked through the system itself. The next area I'm going to talk about is really testing and training management. So tracking competency and awareness through testing and training is another feature. In Tim's presentation, he mentions changes in section 6.2 around your procedure for competency. So with Qualtrax testing and training, this is a way that you can monitor, train, and supervise your personnel to track competency. So how does this work? Well, number one, you can assign role-based trainings across your organization. These trainings can be assigned by management or self-assigned by employees if they want. Also, automatic reminders will automatically get sent to employees every time that they have a new training or test that they need to be completed, and this is something that will automatically happen with Qualtrax. As a quality manager, you will also gain visibility and insight into performance and have access to real-time training data. And then you can also prove employee effectiveness with management sign-off tasks, which is another option. So what I'm going to show you here, back into Qualtrax, are a couple of examples of trainings and tests. And so I'm going to show you a training that we have in the system around bloodborne pathogen training. So this is just an example of a type of training that you could set up in the system. So for example, the description of the training, this is something that you would add to this. You could point somebody to a document that you have or a process that you have maybe creating or that you've got with a workflow that you want them to get trained on. Maybe it's a video you want them to watch. Maybe it's a training that you want them to participate off-site. Maybe it's for a new instrument that they're going to be using. Any type of training that you need to track competency on, you can set a training for up in Qualtrax. They would come in here, say when they were when that training was complete. They could maybe even add a document, maybe a certificate of completion, and then they would hit training is complete. At that point, they can be prompted to take a test. This is an example of a real comprehensive type test that you can have in the system that's really asking specific questions about something that they were trained on. Whether they pass this or they fail this, their managers will even be notified. And if they pass it, managers can even take the next step to verify that that training was understood and maybe mirror them and monitor them to make sure that they truly understand what they were trained on. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is really going to be around some of the technology features of Qualtrax. The first one is really around the Qualtrax hosted offering. So during Tim's presentation, he mentioned the new standard applying to traditional laboratories, but also laboratories with multiple locations and then mobile laboratories. With Qualtrax hosted environment, you're able to access the system from any location with an internet browser. With Qualtrax hosted, we're actually taking all of the IT heavy lifting off of your plate. So we are hosting your system on a secure platform. We'll also upgrade your instance regularly to make sure that you have the latest version of Qualtrax available to you. We also find that we're able to get your hosted installation running quickly, and so you can start implementing Qualtrax very shortly after purchase. Plus, we can better monitor your system to help support you if you go hosted. He also mentioned confidentiality. Qualtrack security and permissions that you will set up in the system for your users will actually allow you to lock down the information to only those that are allowed specific view options. Because the system is configurable, you get to really customize what users see and interact with within the system. We also have the ability to create an auditor license if you're interested. This is a license that you could have that you can give to your auditors when they're coming in that will actually give them a view into your Qualtrax instance. Now, with that being said, as a quality manager, you get to choose what their experience with your system looks like. So you can choose specifically what they'll see, what you want them to see, and what is something that they should not be seeing at that time. And so you can really tailor what that experience is like. Well, another note about Qualtrax is that it can be used for more than just quality initiatives. We have a number of organizations that use the system to help with different HR processes, OSHA standards, safety trainings, vacation requests, or even reimbursements. And so these are options as well. Well, that brings me to the end of my presentation on Qualtrax. Before we jump into into our question and answer session, just to give you a little background, if you have questions beyond this webinar or want to reach out to either Qualtrax or A2LA, this is our contact information. I can be reached at Karen@qualtrax.com. If you would like to see a demonstration of our product, this would be a great place to come and you can request that by just contacting me. If you have questions about the standard changes, please feel free to reach out to Tim Osborne at A2LA. This is his email address, and he would be also very willing to help you out and put you in the right direction if need be. Please feel free to reach out to us afterwards, even if you want to provide us with some feedback about this presentation. So at this time, we're going to move into our questions session. I'm going to invite Tim to join me. Tim, can you hear me?
Hello. I can. Can you hear me?
I can. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. I'm going to take 1 second. I'm just going to look some questions over and see what we can get here. All right, so we do have one question that is coming in. This one's for you, Tim. This is from Joel. And I'm not sure exactly when it came in, but he's asking, does this mean that we need to include as well the sampling in our accredited test scope?
So it's an excellent question. If you are performing sampling that's part of a method that is currently on your scope of accreditation that's part of a test, then by definition it is on your scope of accreditation. However, if sampling is a unique item on your scope because there are ASTMs and other standards available to you that describe specific sampling methods, then yes, sampling would be called out on your scope explicitly.
Great. Thank you for that. Here's another question. We have a question coming in about Qualtrax that I'll take right here. Is Qualtrax used for just 17025 or can it manage other standards? Great question. We can be used for many standards outside of 17025. We have a lot of customers that are 17020, TNI, NAME, ISO 9001 also. And so it really doesn't matter. When it comes down to managing your data around a quality management system, Qualtrax can really help with that. If you have questions, that's something that we can definitely go into even in more detail if you wish. Here's another one, Tim. How soon do we have to implement ISO 17025-2015?
Actually, it's 2017, and the reason I correct that is because it's important in the way ISO requires implementation. So if you are a non-accredited laboratory, then you can implement it whenever you want. If you are an accredited laboratory, independent of the accrediting body, you have to be accredited to the new standard by November 30th of 2020. The standard was released in November 30th of 2017, and the ILAC, or International Laboratory Accreditation Corporation, which governs all of the accrediting bodies around the world, has dictated that you have 3 years to implement the standard.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's see. And keep those questions coming in. We like questions, so please feel free to send them on in. Here's another question for Qualtrax around their hosted environment and the security of it. We get this question a lot, especially with our hosted environment and what the security is. So we actually work with our cloud hosting partner Rackspace, and so they're actually offering the infrastructure for our hosted environment. A part of this actually includes 100% guaranteed uptime. And so if your system were to go down through our hosted environment, we actually give you money back. Rackspace, who we use, is actually ISO 2701-2005 certified and holds the security certifications necessary to ensure that your data is safe. If there's more questions that you have about that, let me know. We have some documentation that we can send you on that. All right, here's another one for you, Tim. Do the sampling requirements also apply when a test method specifies how to acquire a subsample of a larger sample that has been received from the field, as in, for example, soil samples?
So if the test method specifies how to acquire a subsample, then yes, the sampling requirements do apply. One thing you have to keep in mind is that you need to make sure that you are meeting your customer's needs when you are doing the sampling. And when you and the customer agree that a specific sample is going to be drawn per a particular method, then you carry forward all that information into the report and you do it according to what the method says. And the reason that the requirements apply is because when you're taking subsamples, those of you who do that understand that the statistics of determining your detection limits and the undersampling statistics that you have to apply to it all contribute to the uncertainty. And so all of that information has to be conveyed to the person that's providing that test so that they can provide valid results to the customer, and they would understand exactly what the limitations of the sample are and whether or not they're valid for their own use. Good question.
Great. All right, and then I'm going to throw another one at you. How do you think sampling could be accredited independently from the test method if it would be not possible to assure the validity of the results?
That is probably one of the toughest questions I've been asked, so that one's a good one. So in the food safety world, A2LA already accredits labs specifically for sampling, but they do contribute ultimately to some test somewhere that might be used. So food safety right now is the only place I know that does that. I don't think that the T&I regulated labs or those that fall under the environmental requirements currently do that, but it's certainly a viable option. When I was on the working group, there are several economies around the world that accredit sampling as a standalone activity. And they're beginning to look at certification of personnel to support that, to ensure that there's competency of the people that are actually drawing the samples. I hope that answered your question as I understand it.
Great. Thank you. And we have a couple of moments for a few more questions. So I'm going to answer another one here that's about Qualtrax, and it's about setting up. How hard is it to set up Qualtrax, and does it take a long time to implement? So really what we've heard from our team and from our customers and their feedback is Qualtrax is a user-friendly tool. And so one thing that we try to do with our customer success team is walk you side by side with you through this implementation type process. Implementation from the time that we give you Qualtrax to the time that we train you is about a 4 to 6 week process that we work with you on. And that actually includes 2 days of on-site training with your team. And we are actually training you on how to set Qualtrax up, kind of get you started and for your deployment. We really try to make that efficient and effective. Another question for you, Tim, and I think we have time for about two more. For qualitative methods, do the factors affecting uncertainty need to be included in the methods?
So another good question. So qualitative methods, with respect to uncertainty, most accrediting bodies will say you have to understand what the contributors are to the uncertainty, but you don't have to analyze it. You can estimate it if need be. There is a statement in the standard that talks about significance, and it's important for those who are doing qualitative testing understand what the contributors are to that would contribute to the error in the processes, because error and uncertainty are directly related. So is it necessary to be included in the methods? It's up to you and based upon your risk. I would, from my personal perspective, I would say yes, the factors should be listed, or at least the contributors should be listed. The magnitudes thereof, probably not for qualitative methods.
Great. And then one last one, I'm going to send this one to you one as well. If standard ASTM test methods include precision and bias statements, does a laboratory have to determine the uncertainty of testing for those tests?
That is an awesome question. And having reviewed several ASTM methods, they vary depending upon whether or not ASTM E11 committee has determined what the uncertainties look like and how they're formulated. So in many cases, the precision and bias statements that the ASTM releases or allows you to use have taken uncertainty into account. In other cases, they give you a formal mechanism by which you calculate the uncertainties, typically in an annex somewhere that gives you a description. If the annex is normative, then you're required to use the process that they've defined. If it's informative in the annex, then that's for your informational purposes only. But typically, if the ASTM tells you if to do this using a certain number of measurements and how to go about the method of the test, usually the precision and bias statements are valid. Actually, they are valid. It's just a matter of what your customer needs.
Great. Thank you for that. All right. And I've seen that there's a couple of other questions, and we'll be reaching out to you about those to give you answers. There are some questions around how you get some more information about us. Again, you can contact myself or Tim to let you know if you want to see more information about Qualtrax. We actually do bi-weekly webinars. It's a great way to get an introductory, a quick introductory to Qualtrax and what the system looks like. We do 30-minute overviews, and so you can go to our website, go to click events and webinars, and you can register here. If you have questions about costs, that's something you can reach out to us too. We are happy to do a quick analysis about your usage of the system and give you some quotes around that as well. Tim, is there anything else that you would like to say before we end this webinar?
No, I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity and thank the participants for joining and asking great questions, and hope to hear from you soon.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Tim. We really appreciate you and A2LA for this opportunity as well. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and I hope you have a great day, and we look forward to hearing from you. Bye-bye.